Hey guys, welcome to the video. I'd like to build upon my first video, which was titled Stop Arguing with Science, where I explained that I'm somebody who taught myself how to program at the same time as teaching myself how to structure my own mind, which means that I tend to think about the mind in a way very much analogous to the software on a computer and certain programs that are running. And so in that video, I concentrated largely on what I think is a social program that's running out at the moment, which is trust the science or follow the science. Don't bother thinking about things too deeply. There's a scientific structure that's there and it's operating and it's feeding us what we need to know. And I think that this is an automatic mental program that is getting in the way of certain processes that should be engaged at the moment. Furthermore, in that video, I delved a little bit into another social program that's running concurrent to that, which is this idea of just automatically dismissing the idea of conspiracy theories or conspiracy theorists by default. In this video, I'd like to explore that a little bit more and delve into why exactly I think that it is an incredibly dangerous, but also an incredibly stupid automatic program to have running in your mind. So it does have certain validity to it in that there are some ridiculous conspiracy theories out there. And obviously they do capture people. But this program of dismissing conspiracy theories, it has its place there in dismissing the ridiculous ones. But what happens with it is that it ends up overreaching its proper place and it ends up dismissing all notion of conspiracy. And this means that it potentially dismisses things that we should be paying attention to and dismisses actual legitimate conspiratorial behavior that is possibly happening in the world. And so just to dismiss it all by default is a really dumb way of processing the world. And so what I would like to do in this video is to outline where that particular program belongs and where it doesn't belong. And so ideally to possibly help people to constrain it. The idea of, instead of just having automated programs that lead you down a certain path where you're not actually engaging with the intelligence that you have inside your mind, I think it's much better to arrange your particular mental processes and your programs as being modular. So you can start up a particular program where it's necessary. You can view the world through that particular perspective. And then ideally you want to be able to terminate that process, jump into another program, look at the same situation from a completely different perspective, compare them, see which one makes sense. And this is a much better way of approaching things. It's also an incredibly valuable thing to be able to jump into certain perspectives that are the complete opposite of the way you would normally look at the world. And this provides a very valuable counterbalance to what is your default perspective. So before I continue, I just want to say that the spirit of this video is that I would like to try to get across certain ideas that I hope are useful or at least semi-interesting to some people. But I'm also not just lecturing and telling you what the case is. I'm also putting my particular perspective out there into the world and I'm inviting it to be updated and critiqued. And obviously there's going to be certain things that I say that are a bit low resolution. There's going to be probably some things I say that are just wrong. And this is all my way of informing myself and updating my own perspective. So don't take it as me just blasting my opinion onto you that you have to, well, I'm expecting you to accept. I'm also expecting to get feedback and become smarter myself. One primary thing that I want to invoke at the start here is the idea of the bell curve of conspiratorial thinking. And so you can imagine a standard bell curve where in the middle you have all of the majority of the population who tend to not really think about conspiracies at all, or the people who dismiss them and ridicule the idea. And at the lower end, you've got all of the nonsense. So this is where you've got the people who don't really know how to think. And they're the people who might fall into ridiculous beliefs. Let's say flat earth, for example. I tend to not be too dismissive of any perspective because I am somebody who always likes to keep a bit of a caveat there of I don't know for sure. What I do know is that to maintain the perspective of flat earth, they tend to need to dismiss a whole lot of physics. And when you're dismissing the very beauty of the universe itself and the way that the cosmos dance and just all of the mathematics and the incredible beauty of the whole system that we know from physics and astrophysics, etc., then I'm fairly certain that your worldview is flawed. Let's just assume flat earth is down in that lower end of the bell curve. This is the bucket where all conspiracy theories tend to get thrown. They get thrown in with flat earth, they get thrown in with lizard people and fucking God knows what else. But this is where this idea of the bell curve, I think, is incredibly useful. So you think about, you go to that upper end. So you move past the nonsense, you move past the majority of people, and then you get into this other small group of people. And so I think that this is where there are people who know how to think and they know how to analyze things, and they're actually looking for patterns in what we can see that point towards things going on that are beneath the surface. I think that this is where there's a lot of injustice as far as lumping everyone in this category into the other category, because they are vastly different categories, even though they're dealing with the same sort of area. And what these people actually are doing is they're attempting to error correct our society. So from a software analogy, you can imagine that they're somewhat like virus detecting software, where they're looking out for malignant things, malignant code that's running out in the societal structure, and they're trying to point it out and say, this over here doesn't make sense, perhaps we should pay attention to this. But this notion of just simply dismissing any conspiracy theorist type thinking, it's obviously aligned with anybody who wants to act conspiratorially. And I think that this is a very logical and sensible thing to keep in your mind when you're trying to delineate what is nonsense and what might have validity to it. So with that said, I want to continue the theme that I set up in the first video, where I look at a certain post that I've written in order to get an idea very distilled, but then use the video to expand on it and delve into it in more depth. So let's have a look at this one I wrote a few weeks ago. So here's this classic quote: "The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he doesn't exist." And this is attributed to Charles Baudelaire, French poet. Now, this is somewhat of a loose attribution because he did say something very similar to this. This particular quote here is more closely aligned with a quote from the movie The Usual Suspects. In that movie, it was spoken by Kevin Spacey's character. But given that we don't like to speak about Kevin Spacey anymore, we're just going to go with the old, with Charlie B here and attribute it to him. And so first of all, I'd just like to point out that a lot of the time in the modern West, this sort of religious language, it often just gets automatically dismissed. This is another mental program that a lot of us are brought up with, where we just kind of hear anything that's biblical and we just lump it into the category of nonsense. And so there's probably a lot of people who see this quote and they just think, well, the devil doesn't exist, so this quote is bullshit. But I think that what gets missed in a lot of the dismissal of religious ideas is that any sort of ancient narrative like that, where they're valuable, is that they have taken certain things about reality and distilled them into a narrative structure and certain characters, and they're representing certain things about reality. And so I think that you can safely say that the concept of the devil would be a good representation of all the things in human nature that are more on the dark side. So all the evil and the greed and the deception, the devil is a good representation of this. And so in relation to this particular quote, I'm going to invoke the concept of the devil to represent the idea of corruption. You can see here that I've tagged his quote, put it into context here. A society that has been trained to dismiss the notion of conspiracy is a society ripe for harvest. The idea of corruption and the idea of conspiracy are very tightly linked. So in relation to this quote, I'm somewhat tying them together, but I'm going to focus it in on the idea of corruption, but with the acknowledgement that corruption then breeds into conspiracy as it spreads. So when you think about the goals of corruption, the primary goal is whatever self-interested thing that corruption is attempting to achieve. But there's also always going to be a secondary goal, which is to hide the processes of the corruption. So it's attempting to gain something, but it's also attempting to hide it. And so even in the most openly corrupt systems, there's always going to be a veneer there that's providing the illusion that the system itself is not corrupted. And the veneer may be as thin as a uniform. It may even be as thin as just a shared play that everyone is acting out, where everybody knows what's happening, everybody knows it's all deeply corrupt, but everyone is acting as though it isn't. And so I think that when you look at this quote, the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he doesn't exist. I think that this is a good representation of the aim of corruption to hide itself. And I think that this is a very interesting idea in our modern social context, where we see so much of this automated programming in just dismissing the idea of conspiracy and essentially dismissing the idea of corruption, and therefore dismissing the idea of evil and self-interest and greed. And it's like, if these programs are so heavily interwoven into our collective psyche, is this evidence of there being widespread corruption and conspiracy? Because is this an example of the devil, in this case meaning corruption, having done so much work to hide itself that it's managed to get into our very minds, to propagate so much of this idea that conspiracy and corruption is laughable and not even worth thinking about, that's where it's doing a lot of its work. It's getting into our very fucking psyches and removing the idea there. Now, I'm not saying that this is obviously what's happening, but I think it's an incredibly interesting way to think about the current situation. And so this idea of dismissing conspiracy and corruption, I think it shows a real disconnect with reality, because we know that corruption is a common occurrence. We see it in politicians, we see it in CEOs, we even see it at the personal level, where none of us can be 100% certain that our friends or even our family members are not going to act in a way that's beneficial to them and detrimental to us. It's a natural part of being a human, is dealing with betrayal. And yet we seem to have this totally bizarre, irrational belief that it's not something worth thinking about at any sort of large scale. And yet it happens, and we know it happens. And even when we see it happen, and when we see it openly admitted, then we still carry on as though it doesn't. Why are we so trusting? I think to answer this question, it's really useful to start delving into evolutionary history. The evolutionary perspective is an incredibly powerful one because what it allows is it allows you to pull back from just the here and now or even this society, and it allows you to pull back to a much larger picture where you can see all of the backstory and you can see why we are the way we are. You think about our prehistoric environment and all of the selective pressures that we were under that ended up driving the evolution of our modern minds, and you can understand why we are the way we are. Our history is that of very complex social creatures, and you can imagine that there's always been a lot of incentive to align with the collective that we are a part of and to make sure that we don't end up on the outside of it. You have to be able to trust the collective. The collective as a whole has to be able to trust each other. That's how we work together. And so you can't just be someone who's completely paranoid and who doesn't fit in, because you may be allowed to remain within the safety of the collective, but chances are you're not going to pass your genes on because you're not going to find a mate. And so this is where sexual selection plays a role in you aligning with the collective and being trusting. And obviously we managed to build civilization by coming together in greater and greater numbers and building more complex social structures. And that all had to be driven by trust. This is why we're naturally inclined towards trust. We trust as a default. And for the most part, it works really well. And for the most part, trusting in your collective works really well. There's a fairly well agreed upon figure of the percentage of the population who are psychopaths, and that's about 1% of the population. And when you take a global population of 8 billion, and then let's just get rid of a quarter of it. Let's say there's 2 billion people who are too young, too old, whatever. But then you take 1% of 6 billion people, and that's 60 million psychopaths out in the world running around being psychopathic. And the thing about a psychopathic mindset is that it naturally inclines you to climb hierarchical ladders, because you're more interested in making it difficult for other people and sabotaging other people and just doing whatever you can to get yourself ahead. Certain positions within society are more naturally attractive to psychopathic personalities, and more psychopathic people do better at getting into them. And this is something that's also very important to keep in mind, that those in the most powerful positions can be more psychopathic than your average person. Not all of them, but some of them undoubtedly are. And this is not an out there idea. I think it's something that anybody, if they take 2 seconds to think about it, would agree with. And so we act as though the world is an incredibly safe place when it isn't. And I think that this is because we have been lucky enough to live in what has been a real golden age of history, where everything is very safe for the most part, very prosperous. We just go about our lives, and then we're just bestowed with all of this amazing technology, and we have access to essentially the entirety of mankind's knowledge. And it's just been an amazing period of history. But I think it's worth bearing in mind that the reason that it's been allowed to go along like this is because the people who have the most power have also been benefiting from this particular situation. If you look at any graph of wealth inequality over the past few decades, you can see that it's all just massively accumulating up into fewer and fewer people. And this is a real problem. This is an intrinsic problem of capitalism. So it's been benefiting them as much, if not way more, than most of us. So it's been allowed to continue. But the thing about capitalism is that it's predicated on constant growth. But the the aim of constant growth on a planet with finite resources is obviously not sustainable. So there's going to come a certain point in that system where the system is just going to collapse and totally deteriorate. So you can imagine that there's going to be a certain point where the people who are way up at the top of these hierarchies with the most power and influence are going to look around at the state of the world, and they're going to at some point think, okay, something has to change because our position is being threatened, because there's going to be a certain point where things destabilize, and we are, as elite as we are still sitting on top of this gigantic structure. We're not completely separated from it. And so before I continue, because I know that I'm probably setting off a bunch of automated programs even talking about this sort of stuff, what I want to make clear is that I'm not asserting anything. Everything that I say is basically just an exercise in imagination. And this is going back to what I said earlier about being able to jump into different perspectives, being able to boot up a particular program, look at the state of things and explore it and play with it and use your fucking amazing imagination to simulate a particular reality where things are a certain way, people might behave a certain way, and just spend some time in it, because you don't necessarily know which universe you're in. You may be in one of these universes that you end up simulating and imagining and thinking about. And if you are, then you're more mentally prepared to deal with the reality of that and keep an eye out for things that may allude to the fact that you are in such a universe. And so I think it's really important to consider this idea of certain powerful entities potentially wanting to act in a way that is intended to change things, potentially drastically. And so this is where I think the idea of conspiracy needs to be kept on the table, and it needs to be kept as a concept that we actually use instead of just throwing in the bin with a bunch of nonsense. And so when you think about any sort of corruption or conspiratorial behavior, there's only so much you can do to hide it, especially if it's widespread and spreading across many different systems. And especially in a modern age where we are so highly connected and we just can communicate so quickly. And so you would obviously do whatever you can to keep it in the shadows, but then you're not going to be able to keep it all hidden. So it's going to spill out in certain places. And so this is why I think that it would be incredibly valuable to propagate cultural programs that are intended to cause people to believe that it's a good idea and that you're the smart one for dismissing anybody who dares say that there's any sort of conspiratorial behavior going on, because this acts as a mop for the overspill. It means that it can spill out there and you don't have to be completely worried about it, because you've programmed the culture so much that it doesn't actually get into that many places. It remains in a minority, and that minority can just be disparaged and dismissed. Furthermore, even more so than that, even more than hiding it, even more than fostering cultural programs to dismiss it, the most powerful thing that you could do if you wanted to achieve some goal and enact some very complex conspiratorial behavior is that ideally you would wrap that aim into some other narrative that is at face value incredibly virtuous and good and necessary. So if you can get everybody to buy into a certain narrative that you can then hide your real intentions behind, and not only buy into and accept, but also to viciously attack anybody who dares question that narrative, then this would be a really powerful way of achieving your goals. And whether or not this is actually occurring, I can't say for sure. But what I can say for sure is that the devil is out there. There is evil and greed and self-interest out in the world, looking for opportunities to manifest and do whatever it can for its own gains and to hide the fact that it's doing that. So the devil is out there. And so perhaps we should actually be looking out for it instead of just dismissing the very notion that it exists. So I'll just leave you with that thought.